The space race is so different now. It used to be a two-horse race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now there's a long list of spacefaring nations and companies. It's not just about the flag planting anymore. It's about the science, there's money to be made, and our everyday lives are being affected by what's going on in space. Our lives depend on it. So to discuss the how and the why, I'm joined by an expert panel. We've got Melissa Thorpe, the boss of Spaceport Cornwall, now just days away from launching a rocket from the runway of Newquay Airport. We've got Lord Rees, Martin Rees, a world-renowned cosmologist, and the Astronomer Royal, a post, I read, created by Charles II, no less, to map the night sky. And is it true you get £100 a year still?
Don't even get that.
You don't even get that? Well, bad luck.
No.
I think you go and demand it. And also, from New Mexico, we're joined by Mike Moses. There we are, Mike, with the Unity in the background there, your mothership. He is president of Virgin Galactic, who's on a countdown to the company's first commercial flights for space tourists early next year. Fingers crossed, Mike. And we'll also be going live shortly to a NASA astronaut, and that's going to be really exciting. But a quick reminder about the questions. You can submit them by scanning the QR code that was on the card on your seat. And if you're watching on TV or online, you can submit your questions on Twitter using the hashtag BigIdeasLive22. But Melissa, let's start with you. I mean, goodness me, it's exciting to think a rocket launch from the UK.
Yeah, I mean, it is still a bit surreal. 8 years ago, we used to get laughed at, but who's laughing now? We're very close to launching for the first time ever from UK soil from Cornwall. And it's just been such a roller coaster ride. But it's all coming to fruition now down in Cornwall. And we're really just proud of what this is about to do for the UK.
But let's be clear, this isn't a NASA-style vertical launch to space. You've got some other idea. Tell us about what you're going to be doing down in Newquay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're working with Virgin Orbit. So Mike's with Virgin Galactic. We're with Virgin Orbit.
We're not being sponsored by Virgin. That's a complete coincidence.
I don't represent them, but our spaceport is launching our first launch with them. And that basically uses a Boeing 747 that's been modified to carry a giant 70-foot, two-stage rocket under one of its wings. Basically, what it will do is go up partway to space, where it deploys that rocket midair, and that rocket goes into space.
And let's talk to you, Mike. I mean, you're taking a slightly different idea. I mean, you're also using a plane, but you're, again, going to be taking passengers, not cargo, not the satellites that Melissa will be taking up in the first launch from Cornwall.
Yeah, that's right. We have a mothership that's custom built called VMS Eve, and it carries Spaceship Unity, which is behind me here, which is where our pilots and our passengers fly. So we take a ride up to about 50,000 feet and release the spaceship, light the rocket motor from there, and take folks up on a suborbital journey to space. So they get to go experience a few minutes of microgravity, get out of their seats, look out the window, see the Earth below them, the thin blue line of the atmosphere, and the blackness of space before they come back and land at the runway they took off from. So a really great human experience for people to be able to see the Earth from above.
So from satellites to space tourists, you're getting a good sense there already of how people are seizing the opportunities of space. And Martin, do you think that humans should be going to space at all?
Yes. Well, I'm old enough to have remembered Neil Armstrong's one small step. Really inspirational. And of course, at that time, I thought that long before today there'd have been footprints on Mars. But of course, it was 1972 that the last people returned from the moon, and since that time humans have done no more than go into low Earth orbit. But of course space has developed hugely. As you said, we depend on it every day for sat-nav, communications, weather forecasting, etc. And of course for me as an astronomer, we benefited hugely from instruments up above the blurring of the Earth's atmosphere, most recently, of course, the James Webb Telescope. So space has been very exciting, but of course, the other thing that's happened is that robots have advanced hugely. And so maybe we'll come back later, but perhaps I can advertise my book called The End of Astronauts, co-authored with a friend called Don Goldsmith. And here we argue that the practical need for sending humans into space is more or less eliminated because robots can do the exploring with enough AI, and they can fabricate big structures in space. So my line is that space travel is as an adventure and should be left to the private sector. I don't think, if I was an American, I wouldn't want any public money to go towards NASA's human spaceflight program. That's because it's of no practical value now. And also, if NASA does something, it's very expensive because they've got to be very risk averse. The space shuttle was launched 135 times. It crashed twice. Each of those crashes was a big trauma. And that's a less than 2% failure rate, and they tried hard to cut that down. So my line is that we don't need humans in space for practical purposes, but let's leave it to the billionaires who can launch people prepared to accept much higher risks than even 2%. People like hang gliders and round-the-world balloonists and people like that. And maybe someday people will go to Mars, even with a one-way ticket. Elon Musk says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he's 51 now, so 40 years from now, he might do that.
Well, let's come back to the space billionaires in a minute.
Right.
But let me just challenge you on the value of sending human scientists to Mars. The robots, the rovers, are fantastic. But it does need some human operator back here to help decide which rocks to head for, and they're doing that on the basis of a two-dimensional screen. Isn't it not better to send a human who can walk the dust, tap the rocks, decide where to drill?
Yes. Well, that's certainly true today. The Perseverance vehicle on Mars has enough AI to be able to work its way around obstacles and all that, but it can't do the geology. But I would argue that long before we think of sending people to Mars, which will be 20 years from now, the AI will be able to do the geology too, just as well as a human, and of course at vastly less cost, because sending people to Mars, a 6-month journey, is much, much, much harder and much more expensive and more risky than sending them to the moon. So 20 years from now, I think the AI will be able to do most of the science.
Mike, in New Mexico, and it's space tourists for now in near-Earth orbit. Do you have ambitions to, or not yet in orbit, do you have ambitions to go into orbit and perhaps even beyond?
Yeah, sure. I think, with due respect to the Astronomer Royal, the exploration by robots is definitely a less risky thing. But I think you really diminish the experience feedback. The question I always got when I was at NASA and here at Virgin Galactic, why do we send people to space? And I think at the heart of it, there's a fundamental human nature. And while it is risky and expensive, it is very noble, and it gives inspiration and a real purpose. And so, here at Virgin Galactic, we're going to try to let a lot of folks go to suborbit and be able to see the Earth and experience space travel in just a small slice. But I think that has, if you jump ahead 10 years, 20, 30, right, the chance to really transform society to where we view space and space exploration as part of our core fiber. Pretty soon, everybody should hopefully know someone who's been to space. If everything goes well, pretty soon everybody will have the chance to go to space. And when I say pretty soon, I'm talking a decade or so, 2 decades, right? But think of the transformation that will occur, just like intercontinental air travel transformed the way people work here on Earth. I do believe that space travel as an inspiration and as an experience really will help our society transform and drive to the future. On the research side, right, there is a little aspect of space research is one of those areas where you kind of have to build your experiment and hand it to somebody else, whether it's a robot or an astronaut trained up on the space station. And while they're highly trained and they're very skilled, right, your time on your experiment is very limited. So you actually could potentially, while AI is making great advances, you can actually reduce some of the automation if you're there with it. So in a suborbital craft like ours on VSS Unity, you can have the chance to go up and tend to the experiment yourself. and therefore it doesn't have to be as complicated. It can be cheaper, and you can go fly it more often. So I think there's a knee in both sides of that curve that need to be understood, but I think there's great potential for the human experience as well.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, Melissa, I think it's what you're doing down in Cornwall is really exciting, and you've got satellites in the first rockets. But do you see the day where you will be launching tourists from Newquay Airport as well?
Yeah, we get asked that question quite a lot. We're focused solely just on satellites at the moment. That is difficult enough. You know, our friends in the US have been doing it for 50 years, and it's taken them that long to get to the point where we're now sending tourists up. So I think we have a bit of a ways to go here in the UK. I couldn't sit here and say that would never be part of, you know, what could potentially happen in the future. We're an airport, we're a port, and a port does things. It brings people in and out, and cargo in and out. So I can imagine one day there will be an opportunity for us to look at that. But at the minute, we're just focused on satellites. We'll get that right first. But saying that, we have partnered with Sierra Space, who are looking at the Dream Chaser and as a return landing site from space, and that will be crewed. So that in itself, and I think you know there's slightly the connotations around space tourism, but human space flight is something that we're all interested in because there's so much value, as Mike has said, you know, to what that could bring to us back here on Earth by sending people into space.
It was fascinating being down at Spaceport Cornwall recently. It was there was a lot of people down there, a lot of the space industry from the UK were all making their tracks down to see what you're doing. And it really just showed the health of the industry here in the UK, how important it is. 47,000 people are employed by the industry. It's worth $16.5 billion pounds a year. But at the moment, although we're really good at building satellites, we're having to launch them from as far away as New Zealand.
Exactly, and that's the whole reason that I'm sat here, is that we build a large majority of the world's small satellites in this country. Every single one of them goes overseas to launch, and that's not just a missed market opportunity, but also if you think of it from a geopolitical perspective, but also from an environmental perspective, if we can control the way that we launch our own satellites, it gives us a lot more opportunity to create, you know, a more responsible and ethical kind of launch that goes on to create economic value to the UK as well. So it's, for us, that's the prize, is creating a launch capability that supports the UK marketplace, but doing in a way that we feel proud of.
Martin, are you excited about what's happening here in the UK now with rocket launches and satellites, the use of satellites and so on?
I think it's great, and you'll be launching very soon 6 or 7 very useful satellites, so that's great. As regards sending people, I agree it's inspirational, and it's going to become fairly routine for low Earth orbit. But if I were to offer Virgin advice, I would say they should not use the phrase space tourism, they should call it space adventure, which is not ever going to be as routine as flying in an aircraft. And if you call it space tourism, people get that impression, and the first accident will kill it all off. Whereas if you say it's space adventure, then just as people don't stop mountaineering when someone gets killed on a mountain, then they won't stop going into space. So I think it should be presented as an adventure and paid for by the people who go and not by taxpayers.
Well, look, I think we better bring in Mike here. Should we be calling them space tourists? Is that okay?
Actually, you know, that phrase, yeah, no, I don't think that phrase truly captures it. I think adventure's good, future astronauts, explorers, whatever term you want to use, the point of it is a transformational experience by traveling to space. Whether you're going to go on a suborbital journey for a short duration, you go up on a short orbital mission, you go to a space station or a commercial space station, right? All of those, I think, have that same flavor of transformational experience for you as a human, as a person, right? And then the ability to come back to Earth with that effect. They call it the overview effect. When you go to space and you're able to look back on the Earth, you come back a little bit changed with your perspective. You see the fragility of the atmosphere. You recognize the lack of borders and the big blue marble. What the phrase is, right? That we're all astronauts on spaceship Earth, right? And you kind of recognize that a little bit. And it does change you. And I think the more folks that get that perspective, we're seeing a huge shift here recently with just the awareness in social and economic impacts of climate and the environment and needing to protect that and take care of it, right? And I view the act of being able to go and experience space as kind of a drive it home to get to see that. So not only does space let you launch the satellites that let you observe the Earth and see the climate change and the effect, but being able to witness it with your own eyes helps you kind of transform the pieces of the world you affect directly.
Mike,
so I do think it's not so much tourism, but I think it really is a practical purpose.
Mike, you couldn't have set up our NASA astronaut any better. Let's bring in the professional. This is Nicole Stott, former NASA astronaut, 2 space flights, 104 days in space, 1 spacewalk, and a spectacular spacesuit there in the background, Nicole. What's going on?
Well, nice to be here, and I appreciate hearing all the comments from everyone. And the spacesuit behind me is part of, its name is Exploration. It's part of a program we do at the Space for Art Foundation, working with kids all over the world, uniting a planetary community of children through the awe and wonder of space exploration and the healing power of art.
So you're really inspiring people through your own travels in space. And Mike was talking there about the overview effect, that feeling that people who are looking down on the Earth get, that connection with humanity, that love of the planet. And you saw that yourself, didn't you? And you tried to express it. You were the first person to use watercolors in space. And I think you've actually got the painting with you. Let's hold it up and tell me why you tried to express what you were seeing.
Well, here it is. So it's a painting of a little chain of islands I saw on the northern coast of Venezuela called Las Rocas. And I remember looking out the window and as I would do every time I looked out the window, just being in awe, surprised by what I was going to see, the overwhelming beauty of our planetary home. And I remember thinking, wow, it looks like somebody had reached down with a paintbrush and painted a wave on the ocean. And it became my favorite picture from space. And so I decided to use that for my inspiration to paint while I was there. But it has also inspired the work I'm doing myself in trying to share the spaceflight experience in a way that does just what you guys are talking about, tries to communicate this significance of our role as crewmates here on our planetary spaceship. Just this realization that we live on a planet, it's a big one. And I know in hearing the words from Martin as well, I think it works the other way too. If we open ourselves up to it, if we think about the fact that every day we walk outside, we're standing on a planet. And when we look up at this blue sky that seems to go on forever, remind ourselves that it's just this veil thin protective layer wrapping around us, just like the hull of our spaceship. And there's something about people, humans experiencing that I think, and I can say for me, for sure, has a transformational effect, has a, not just, I experienced it, wasn't that awesome, but it puts something into you where you really want to come back to Earth and take action as a result of it as well. And I believe every one of these people that's experiencing it through the flights that are available now commercially are coming back with that same kind of resolve.
And I was thinking about this week, now that our Artemis program is underway, we're going back to the moon, which is really exciting. But those images taken by Orion, looking back at our tiny, fragile blue marble against that black curtain of space. I mean, those kinds of images taken by the Apollo astronauts really helped to give birth to the environmental movement back in the 60s and 70s. It is a thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I absolutely believe it. I mean, like Martin said too, I have these vivid memories of watching, Neil and Buzz walking on the moon, knowing that Mike Collins was orbiting it, and going outside and looking at the moon and being, even at 7 years old, understanding that that was a really extraordinary thing. And then these images that are coming back now that are kind of allowing us to reflect on Apollo, but looking forward to what Artemis will bring. I think they're showing us that we're always looking for that connection to ourselves. It's part of why we as humans want to get out there, and explore our planetary home from a totally new vantage point. And I love those pictures because whether it's taken from, an Orion spacecraft, or as it will be from humans again when we're traveling there, oh my gosh, we really, I don't think we get any better sense of who and where we are in space together, and the significance of this place in space, this very special planetary home that we have.
But having seen the world's most powerful ever rocket taking off from Kennedy, I mean, what would you give to be on the rocket to the moon and walk there one day? As, let's face it, no
Oh
woman,
my God.
no woman has walked on the moon yet, but that is the ambition of Artemis, to make sure that a woman will be there, a person of color will be there, and the hope is that that will be in the
Could
next
be
2
in
or 3 years.
combo. I have a very good friend, Stephanie Wilson, who would meet both of those criteria. I'd love to see her walking on the moon. And I've already told her she should be packing me and her luggage with her to go.
But you would love to go. You'd love to walk on the moon, would you?
Absolutely. And I think that, the moon, it's like our partner in space, right? We all have a connection to it in some way. I think that I would absolutely love to walk on the moon. I look forward at least to living vicariously through my friends and others that will. And knowing that by establishing our presence there, in a more permanent sense, settling there in a permanent way, will allow us to take advantage, and I say that in a positive way, of the resources available on the moon, for us to lift some of the industry that we have on Earth off the planet and into space, all for the benefit of life on Earth. And as we take those, those steps, those 6 to however many months it'll be heading towards Mars, we can do that from the moon in a, in a much more efficient way than we can lifting ourselves off the planet. And I think that's part of the plan as well.
So we obviously all eyes on you, Nicole. I mean, you must be really popular at parties, just reliving your experiences in space. But let's bring you into the wider discussion. I mean, Martin, I mean, when you hear people like Nicole speaking, I mean, there is something about seeing space exploration through human eyes, isn't there? It is an inspiration for a new generation. We saw that with Tim Peake and the work that the UK Space Agency did to try and get kids, if not into space, certainly into STEM subjects, science and maths.
Yes, but I think lots of people are fascinated by the pictures of deep space sent back by probes of the outer planets, and of course by telescopes like James Webb of very, very distant nebulae and galaxies and things. That's inspirational. And one of the most exciting things discovered by astronomers in the last 10 or 20 years, as most people probably know, is that most of the stars in the sky are orbited by retinues of planets, just like the sun's orbited by the Earth and the familiar planets. And we're starting to study these. And one thing that would be really inspirational as a long-term goal, and I discuss it in this book, is that by 2068, some descendant of James Webb, a much bigger and more powerful telescope than that, will be able to give us an image of an Earth-like planet orbiting another star, perhaps with life on it. Why do I say 2068? That's centenary of the famous picture taken by Ed Anders, which you mentioned, which was indeed very inspirational, showing the Earth's fragile biosphere. But 100 years after that, then we may have an inspirational picture taken of a planet like the Earth orbiting another star. We can never go there, but it'll still be inspirational and will tell us more about life in the universe.
You were talking earlier on how public money should not be used for human exploration, that it should be private companies like SpaceX. I mean, look, throw this out to the panel, just wave at me if you're remote, but how important do you think it is for companies like SpaceX to be playing such a really big, important role in exploration? What they're doing now, the risks they take, the rapid acceleration that they're making in technology that is pushing forward the possible. Anybody? Mike, come on, you used to work in NASA, and yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think it is really important. We're seeing a real transformation and inflection. If you just step back a decade or two, right, the commercial satellite launch industry, when when Space Shuttle was formed, right, the idea was we didn't need any more expendable rockets. All satellites launches could occur on the Space Shuttle here in the United States. And the Challenger accident really revealed that to be a pretty bad plan. No diversity in launch capability. And it sparked a revolution. Ariane stepped right out into the commercial market. The rest of the industry responded quickly. And now we see a plethora of commercial satellite launch capability around the world. The same thing is now happening with human launch capability. And pretty soon, I think the next thing on the horizon will be commercial destinations. So it's one thing for the transportation up and down to space, but now can you have a commercial destination that you go to? The space station, the International Space Station, is an absolute marvel of engineering and a really great international partnership. But as Martin was saying, right, it's a government program, and I think we're right on the cusp of seeing commercial destinations to go in low Earth orbit, and then soon high Earth orbit and beyond into near lunar space. So I think with that transformation, we'll really see yet another explosion in the private sector of how we innovate and advance and open opportunities to all. And so with there's definitely a role for the government, right? They're setting big missions, setting big priorities, helping with large technological development, and then helping regulate not only to keep things safe and steady, but a little bit of also let that innovation occur. I think that's a great partnership between the governments around the world and private industry around the world.
We're talking today about who owns the future. Isn't there a danger that if billionaires have command of space, it's them who owns the future? It's not us and our stake through publicly funded space travel. Martin.
Yes. Well, we can cheer them on as risk takers, and I hope that by the end of the century there will be a small community on Mars, and we could cheer them on. But I think they should be privately funded. I think that's...
But isn't it a mistake that we've made with social media, that we have very little control about the moderation? We just trust it to the people who own the companies.
Well, yes, but that's where everyone cares about that. Everyone uses social media, whereas I don't think that the same is true here. But I mean, I'd like to say that the private sector has been hugely important. I mean, SpaceX, of course, it's a new rocket, I think, to be tested soon, called Starship, is the size of Artemis, but much, much cheaper, because even the first stage is going to be reusable. I think that's right. So Artemis is using old technology by the standard of what SpaceX can do, and that's why it's so expensive. And indeed, I'm not just being cynical. The article on the topic in last week's Economist headlined "White Elephant in Space" in reference to Artemis, because it is old technology. That's why it's been very expensive. But the SpaceX and the private companies have really made huge improvements and brought down the cost, and I think we should all welcome that.
Thank you so much. Right, now look, it's your turn. Come on, let's ask some questions.
No, yeah,
I think let's give the audience a chance here. So a reminder, you can submit your questions by scanning the QR code. If you're watching on TV or online, you can submit your questions on Twitter using the hashtag BigIdeasLive22. Has anybody got any questions? We've got a question here on the front row. See if you'd like to stand up.
Hi there. It's absolutely amazing being here and meeting you guys in person. My question is what would people in the space industry, especially students who are interested in joining the space industry, what kind of advice would you give them, especially for the UK, to join the UK Space Agency and just general space industries within the UK?
Melissa, go on, take that one.
Yeah, that's definitely something that's happening right now with us. And I'm very lucky to be going into schools and universities almost on a daily basis and speaking to students. And launch is as we've talked about, space is exciting, it's inspirational. Launch especially is massively inspirational. We're now just starting to see that here in the UK, going into places that have never imagined they'd be in the space industry, really deprived areas of Cornwall, for instance, and they're being suddenly told that space is happening on their doorstep. And for us, it's a responsibility to get them excited, but then show them the pathways into the industry. And for me, the best thing that we could do for the space industry is not narrow it down to just the space industry. It crosses absolutely everything. All industries now use space in some way or another. So for me, my main message to anybody interested is, you can get involved in whatever you're interested in. There's so many amazing programs out there that UK Space Agency put on, that UK Space, that the Satellite Applications Catapult put on. There's so many out there, and it's not just necessarily for people interested in the space industry, and that's what's so exciting about it. But yeah, obviously come work for us if you want. That'd be great. We need more women.
So we've got another question from Dave on Twitter. How do we justify the emissions of space travel / tourism, given there's no feasible planet B? Should we not use these immense resources and human intelligence on solving problems on Earth first? I'm turning to you, Mike.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, some of the, and you did too, Thomas, right? Some of the first awareness of the impact on the planet from every industry and people in general came from those Apollo missions where we first saw the blue marble, and then all the satellite launches and the observation satellites that have been up there doing science and research specifically on the environment. So I think space is what enables that in the first place. And so we shouldn't diminish the contribution it makes. But obviously, as responsible stewards of the planet, we also need to look at our own impact upon it. And so I think it's important to be, you have to be on both sides of that equation and do so responsibly. So for example, here at Virgin Galactic, we've designed our ship. One of the reasons we went with an air launch technology is that it is fully reusable. And I don't just mean reusable 10 or 20 times, I mean 500 or 1,000 times, right? These ships are built for a 5 or 10 year lifetime, and we can get hundreds and hundreds of missions out of them. There's a few components that need to be replaced. We can work on the sustainability there. The impact we have on the ground can also be worked on, right? So we never want to stop, but I think it's important to recognize you have to weigh the value as well as the impact of what you're doing. So I think we see a global surge in attention on this, and I think we all plan to be good stewards of the planet that we want to go explore.
Just briefly, Melissa, because I know space sustainability is really important to you in Cornwall, isn't it? Space for good is your thing.
Yeah, Space for Good is our purpose, and it's building on exactly what Mike just said. But, our issue with the industry as it's gone on is space has always been quite secretive. It's not been very transparent, and that's something I think that fundamentally needs to change as more commercial businesses come in, but more public become engaged in the industry. We're becoming multiplanetary species. We need all of you to be involved in that conversation. So for us, it's really important that we, first of all, start with transparency. So what is the carbon impact? And that's really difficult because not a lot of people have been asked that question before. Not a lot of launch operators have been asked what your carbon impact is. What happens when the stages fall into the sea? Those big questions have not really been massively researched or understood, or the impact on the atmosphere as something goes through it. So that's what we're trying to fundamentally understand. As Mike said, air launch is a lot less impactful, but we're not going to just stop there. We want to look at, how do we look holistically across the life cycle to decrease that impact so that when we're launching these incredible technologies, we're not adding to the problem.
And we've got a question from Anthony Baker. Anthony, where are you? Just wait for the microphone. We'll get one to you, and then you can ask your question to the panel. Just stand so we can see you. That's it.
Hello, thank you. So the European Union has a space program called Copernicus, which is Earth observation, looking at the Earth. The UK is likely to pull out of that system, releasing hundreds of millions of pounds. What would the panel do with that money for the UK space industry?
Martin.
Well, let's say this is one of the downsides of Brexit, that although fortunately we are in the scientific program of ESA, we are not in the applications programs like Copernicus and Galileo, and this is bad news. I think we need to spend the money, if we can't revive it, on other environmental exploration, preferably from space, but also doing more on the ground. Because if I can go back to what was said earlier, I think that the impression of the Earth from space has had a positive effect on making people care more about the environment, but it doesn't produce very much. People may worry that these rockets pollute the Earth, but each rocket, I guess, is not too different from one flight of a jumbo jet, so that's not big. But thinking about the environment, I do disagree very much with Musk and people in talking about escaping the Earth's problems by sending millions of people to Mars. I think that's a dangerous delusion. We've got to focus on solving these problems here on Earth. It's a doddle to do those compared to terraforming Mars, although as we know it's very difficult. But I think as part of that, then we need to engage with the science. And of course, if we can't have Copernicus, which is very sad for the UK, then we must develop other areas. I mean, for instance, to give one example, I think the UK could lead in computer modeling of climate change. I know there's a famous space scientist called Tim Palmer in Oxford who talks about a CERN for climate change, which would have big computers to do far better modeling of climate change. So there's something we can do on a European scale, even if we can't be part of Copernicus.
Thank you for that question, Anthony. So Luca on Twitter asks, are there plans to colonize the moon in the next 5 years? Well, Nicole, you must be pretty tapped into what NASA does these days. I mean, do you think we should be going to the moon and colonize it?
Well, I think we should be going to the moon and settling it. I don't know that I'd use the word colonizing, but yeah, I think there's purpose in it. I think there is plans for it. I'll have my fingers crossed that those people are making those first steps in the next 5 years. That would be a wonderful, I think, very meaningful follow on to this Artemis 1 flight that's going on right now. And I look at this like part of the steps to the answers to the earlier questions as well, about why space, why not here, when in reality all of that we're doing in space is ultimately about here. Had the opportunity to participate in COP26 last year, where after doing some research, discovered, to my surprise even, that over 70% of the data we need to measure the vital signs of our planet are coming to us from space. And these public-private partnerships that we have going on right now are the things, both through the public money and the private money, that are leading us in a much, I think in an accelerated fashion, to be able to use that data to solve our planetary challenges, but also to help us travel, as humans further from Earth. One day, I hope it's not impossible, Martin, for us to be looking at those other planets around those different suns as possible homes for us in kind of that interplanetary Star Trek future, if you will. And I think this positioning of ourselves on the moon really is going to be one of the greatest steps for us lifting our lifting ability, our launch ability off of Earth, and solving a big part of what that problem might be by actually taking us to other places in space from the surface or the orbit of the moon.
Thanks, Nicole. Just another one on Twitter, Jason Stone. My daughter would like to ask, what would it take to make a rocket electric and not so reliant on fossil fuels? You're a dreamer, Martin. Do you think that could be done?
Well, of course, the trouble with electric power, as we know from attempts to have electric aviation, is that batteries are very heavy. So I think it's going to be very hard to have an alternative to what we now have to provide the big thrust for launching a rocket.
People do talk about space lifts, don't they? That is taken reasonably serious. There's some way you might be able to have people going up and down to orbit using some kind of lift system.
Well, the future is, of course, space elevator, where you have the power on the ground. Because, of course, the trouble is that the rocket, when you launch it, is weighed down by the fuel, which weighs a lot more than the actual cargo. So one could get around that, but that's a huge technology. You want to have this space elevator 20,000 miles high out to the geostationary orbit. So that's hard. But I think that, it's hard to substitute for the high thrust you need to launch. But of course, nuclear power can be used to provide small amounts of power for a long time. And already so-called RTGs have been used on deep space missions. And so I think that's feasible, but I defer to the experts on the possibilities for nuclear power in space for long duration.
Mike, do you think you can ever see nuclear power being used on your kind of craft?
I think the weight issue and the thrust issue is really, like Martin said, a huge challenge. So I think once you're in space, you have those options open up for you. But to get out of the gravity well of Earth, I think for at least the foreseeable future, the chemical propulsion systems are kind of where we're limited to until we have a massive technological breakthrough. And the focus on reusability and lowering the cost of access, I think we see better technologies there. I think on the ground side, certainly the chance to apply electrics and renewable energy sources is a wonderful thing. But for the actual act of transporting out of the gravity well, I think we're, no pun intended, stuck for a little while.
And another one on Twitter, and I think this one's for you, Melissa, and it relates to space debris. Whether there's a risk of a cascade event. We're sending so many rockets up now that there is a danger of a collision. And I guess you need to think, as we're making space even more accessible with Spaceport Cornwall, and we've got two in Scotland, which are hoping to come on stream next year, all of those taking up multiple satellites. Space is getting pretty crowded.
Yeah, and again, going back to responsible launch, as a gateway to space, it is a responsibility to look at, the technologies and the satellites you're launching to space, what happens at their end of life. And it's a huge topic in the industry as well as in the general public, which is fantastic because 8 years ago when I first started in this industry and I sat down at a conference and you'd hear all these incredible ideas about how to mitigate against space debris, catching it with magnets or nets, but they weren't getting funded. And they weren't getting the investment to get off the ground, literally. And that's changing, and that is really down to political interest as well as the public. And we get these questions, probably the top 5 question I get all the time. So you're starting to see that change, and you're starting to see startups with really incredible technologies for this starting to get funded. So on our first launch in a few weeks, we have a company called SpaceForge. They're a startup out of Cardiff. And they're doing something called in-orbit manufacturing. They're looking at reusability of satellites as well. That's just the start of them, and they're getting venture capital involved. And then it goes to regulations. We kind of touched on it earlier. There's not really been an onus on any company to clean up their orbit or to clean up their products once it comes to end of life. And I think, again, that's something that's changing. So our regulations with the UK Space Agency, they're looking at an end-of-life policy, deorbiting. What happens to your satellite? With these small satellites going up that might only have, 5 to 10 years of a lifespan. We need to start to consider this and put the onus back on the companies to clean up their technology so it doesn't cause, as we send more humans to space, any issues.
One last question from the audience. Andrew Karen, where are you? At the back there. Just hang on a minute, we'll get a microphone to you.
So I'm a founder of Active Kinetic One. We develop a new energy for electricity. And our question is, how are we going to power thousands of people in space? Obviously, there's no fossil fuels. So what's the method that we've got for interplanetary power? Incidentally, we have actually got a solution for that we think is quite good. But how would you guys do it at this stage?
So Martin, just briefly, how are we going to power a human settlement on another planet?
Yes. I would guess with solar energy. And one thing which I'd add as a footnote is that the idea of getting solar energy in space and beaming it down to Earth, it seemed crazy 30 years ago, but with the ability of the new SpaceX rocket to launch 100 tons of stuff at a time and robots to assemble it, that's no longer crazy.
Martin, I'm going to have to cut in there. We're coming to the end of our time. Sorry, we're against the clock being live broadcast. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for joining us. Our panel here, experts, giving us some sense of excitement about the future of space.